Straker.
Here.
Lee.
Here.
Ready?
Yeah.
I pledge allegiance to
To
provide meaningful content.
provide meaningful content.
Don't get offensive.
Don't get offensive.
Glorify the music royalty.
Glorify the music royalty.
Catch the roundabout.
Straker here,
Lee, present.
and we're about to catch the roundabout. Miles Davis, that's who we're talking about
David
today.
Smiles.
We're gonna
He's the
definitely
man.
we're gonna get into it because the man had a massive legacy in jazz. Listen, there's movies you can watch, you can read his autobiography, you can listen to his music. We're just gonna go through some of it, but I would say if I said for me, where I gleaned onto Miles Davis, I got into fusion early and John McLaughlin and all that stuff, and then all of a sudden it was like, hey, he played for.
When did you get into it first time and how? What was the record? What was your first?
So, for Miles Davis, good question. Like the first record I got into, I don't think we got Bitches Brew. When I say we, me and my friend Matt, we bought it, put it in his house. We didn't understand it. We were just like, oh, okay, this is interesting. We just bought it. Go, oh look, we're interesting. We have it, but I don't think we listened to it.
How old were you?
Yeah, high school.
Uh-huh.
High school. And then I knew who he was, but I didn't know I was allowed to listen to jazz. You have this mentality like, oh, that's something separate. Right now, a kid can go hit his phone and go listen to Miles Davis. But he crept into your life through also when there was the actor Cicely Tyson, who he was married to. And Cicely Tyson still made some movies and things. So when I was in 8th grade, years before that, the teacher mentioned, oh, Cicely Tyson's married to Miles Davis, jazz trumpeter. And I'm like, okay. So then I knew who he was, but you didn't listen to, Miles that much when you're young. You're just trying to find out little pieces about him. Then we got Bitches Brew. But then I remember getting Decoy and the albums he had at that time that I was just checking out. I wasn't going into Kind of Blue or any of his period. But just so you know, in 1989, I saw Miles Davis at the Pier with John McLaughlin trio opening up, which had John McLaughlin, Jonas Hellborg, and Trilot Gertu doing percussion. And Miles opened with, Miles played with his electric band afterwards. He had Kenny Garrett in the band. He had all great players. He wasn't there at the time, but I also would say that I didn't think Miles that night was awesome, fantastic. He was more stepping on his players, playing over their solos, something uncomfortable on the stage, but the band was supreme. But hey, that's the way things are sometimes. But then
It was very immediate kind of.
yeah, I was getting into the electric stuff, but then I got more deep in the 90s is when you take the dive like head first, and yeah, you go by Kind of Blue because you start to learn about it through even a John McLaughlin. You're like, oh wow, how do I not have this? So then you get Kind of Blue, you read all the stuff on it, and it's significant 1959 release, modal jazz, John Coltrane, Cannibal Adderley, Gil Evans, Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, and Jimmy Cobb. Everyone will talk about that to the end of time. So good to learn and listen to the album as far as the patience for acoustic jazz, which anyone can begin there. Also, in a silent way, where I had an interest because I'm like, oh wow, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, Joe Zawinul, Dave Holland, Tony Williams, Wayne Shorter, all on one record. And it was very, when you heard the electric keyboards kick in and the guitar, it was very Miles, because Miles played over everything in his tone. Miles had an unmistakable tone. And then you start to dig around, you realize, oh wow, Miles has all these decades of bands of music to listen to, so you're having to keep up. You go out, you buy Roundabout Midnight, then you get into his, not just his quintet in the 50s with John Coltrane, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones, But then you'd get into the quartet in the 60s, which Tony Williams, Ron Carter, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, and Miles. And you're like, wow, this guy's able to move and make different moves. But he has a sound that carries whether he's playing faster or slower. In the 70s, when that electric period happened, it moved into something that wouldn't be categorized as jazz or purely jazz. You know, two guitar attacks, funk, all these things were happening.
He was exploring, he was exploring styles, and
Yeah.
he had his agendas, whatever. But it was always music. It was always music, really. It's like it remained authentic. Whatever his take was on like current whatever trends. I mean, he makes his own trend. I think with that, call it anything at Isle of Wight. It's a good example where he was at that time.
The Isle of Wight concert, where you probably saw that footage. You saw the movie thing. What's called?
Yeah, I mean, call it anything because he said when they asked him what should we call this piece,
he made
25 minutes ago.
There's a film called Electric Kind of Blue, I believe they called it.
There's a documentary about the entire. So all
and they play the concert.
Like Keith Jarrett and.
It was so exciting because you see Keith Jarrett playing electric keyboard, Chick Corea on the other side playing electric keyboard, Dave Holland playing freaking electric bass, Jack DeJohnette
was there,
and Gary Bartz on sax, and you're watching that on the stage in front of all these hippies, all these people that were there to see Jethro Tull, and
Free was there,
and it carried
and the Who, I think.
Yeah, that was. I mean, just like Miles did.
Interesting combination. Yeah.
It handled that crowd. It really handled that crowd to have those virtuosos playing. You know, it's funny. All these guys had different styles that they played away from Miles, and inside Miles, you're just playing Miles music. And then I also found it interesting about his self-exile period. You know, in the '70s, when he's just like, 1975, after he makes that album Agartha, the double live album in Japan, just like Pangea. The guy's like, yeah, I'm not doing music anymore. Leave me alone. I'm going to my apartment to do drugs and hang out, and I don't want to talk to anybody. And he had this solitude, isolation period where he was being coaxed to come out of retirement. Eventually, I think the guy's name was George Butler from Columbia. I think if you're listening and I got it wrong, forgive me. But
Wikipedia.
Right. And then by 1980, when he came back with the We Want Miles and the Man with a Horn and all these albums that he, jazz critics are kind of tough. They're like, oh, that's not perfect. Or, they were all, but really he was cultivating the next guys like Mike Stern, right? John Schofield, Marcus Miller, and all these guys that would end up being big guys in jazz that were working with Miles into the 80s. And then when he got to the comfortable place of, after he made Decoy, he made, what was the one with Time After Time? I can remember it. What can I? I Know I Will.
Tutu or something.
Oh, You're Under Arrest. That's the one where Sting plays a French whistle. And it has John McLaughlin, and John Schofield on it.
What was the name of that one? Tutu or something like that?
Tutu came in 86. Yeah. Tutu was different because Tutu was it was a very different Miles thing because, he's talking with Marcus Miller and he gets the idea, hey, maybe I don't need all these sessions musicians. Maybe I can just record parts with you. And he kind of got used to working with technology a little bit, which if he could do it where it doesn't seem selfish and weird because, he went back to having a band by the time he did Amandla in 1989. Aura in 89 was one he did overseas. He got an award for that. He was getting an award from overseas, and John McLaughlin's on that. A lot of Europeans on that, and it just resonated really well. That guy Pal Mickelborg was the trumpet player with him on that, and then he went in his mini rap direction for a tiny bit, which was he did that. They released Dubop in 1992. He had died in 1991. And then I remember in 2019, just not too long ago, they released Rubber Band, which was little fractions of songs that were reworked.
So it's great again, like what we talked about, like in our other episodes. We live in an amazing time because in the last 15-20 years there were so many albums that got re-released with so many bonus tracks and
so many.
There are live shows that now they have kind of legal clearance so they can get released and we are You're just enjoying the.
We're making out so well with the bonus cuts and the box sets of different things. Now, the thing for the listener that they say, hey, why should I listen to Miles Davis or whatever? Well, think about it like this. Think about like who went
And where in whichever era you want, you won't be disappointed.
and who went
You will discover.
five decades. Who did that, right? So if you have in the late '40s, the tail end of the incubation of bebop, and you find those early albums with songs with Charlie Parker, and then you get into Miles Davis. All Stars, more or less, and then you move into the first quintet in the 1950s, and realize people don't realize he would do a date with Sonny Rollins, and one with Jackie McLean, one with like Thelonious Monk. He had all these big names dropping into his band. Horace Silver, just people that you'd be like, oh wow, I didn't realize that, and then he got to that quintet
And then
again.
Coltrane and Miles
And then the other relationship that developed in the late 50s, Gil Evans. So Gil Evans, when he did Miles Ahead, jumping into orchestral, jazz orchestral type territory, he was, and then moving into like Porgy and Bess, I think him and Miles got along really well. Two different kinds of guys, because Gil Evans looking like, he's a Canadian, very straight-laced diplomat looking guy. He wasn't, quote unquote, in it for the money or the glory. He would score these.
He had his own musical journey. I mean, there's a Hendrix album as well of his arrangements. I mean, he's the man.
He had a great vision, but he didn't get paid or credited for a lot of stuff he did with Miles. Talked about in a book about Gil Evans, but by the time
we won't get much into dirty laundry stuff. Let's stick to music.
Oh, we are.
There will be lots of heavy stuff there.
But Sketches of Spain being the biggest, like, well-known album. For Miles Davis and Gil Evans, taking all these pieces and just really reworking them, like a Concerto di Arangue. I guess maybe I said it wrong, but the rework of that is just it strikes as very beautiful, because Miles' horn over the way it was scored came off really beautiful. And I'll give you a quick laugh. There was a show on television people might remember on AMC, Mad Men. Did you ever see that show? So Mad Men was about, advertising guys that worked, on Fifth Avenue back in the 1950s.
Oh, the show from the last... Yeah.
So Donald Draper,
I saw, I think, the first 2 episodes, but it's very well done.
So I remember watching it one time. John Hamm.
Uh-huh.
And, he's always got girlfriends on the side of his wife. So he gets this young, hipster chick who lives in the Village. And he goes to her apartment because he just would hang out, and all of a sudden, like, all these young guys are sitting around. And while I'm watching the episode, I thought I heard the percussion at the beginning of Sketches of Spain, and I'm like, wait, is that it? And sure enough, they put it on. He hit, so all of a sudden,
actual version that they licensed.
They look at Donald Draper, and they're like, because they're like the hippies, and he's like the unhip businessman at this point, and they're like, "Hey man, we're gonna." And he goes, "So what are you doing?" And he goes, "Yeah, well, we're gonna get high. We're gonna listen to Sketches of Spain from Miles Davis." And Donald Draper just goes, "That's what you're going to do?" Like he found an alien, and then these guys all pass out listening to Sketches of Spain, and I'm like, okay, I'm okay. You want to use the album like that, just for fun. And then Gil Evans also wrote parts for the quintet in the '60s. So with all the stuff, when you have a guy like Wayne Shorter as the tenor saxophone player, and you have guys like Herbie Hancock floating around, and guys who can write, like Ron Carter wrote a composition or two. Still, he would bring in Gil Evans quietly to come in and say, hey, could you maybe help, arrange this a little better? And he would, happily. So you got different phases of Miles. That's why I would recommend people to listen to him, because let's say, if you're into the virtuosity of a John Coltrane, then you got to dive into his work with Miles Davis, because you'll enjoy it thoroughly. If you're looking at bebop as a big interest, you'll get that out of his earlier group, his non-ed of 9 people, with Jerry Mulligan, who was born in Queens Village. And then if you go into, the modal jazz that he would do with Kinda Blue, and then the orchestral stuff, then the quintet doing he wasn't doing free jazz, which a lot of people were doing. He was doing his version of, hey, this is just more interesting quintet jazz.
And then Betty Davis period.
Right.
And importance of Betty Davis
Right.
in his career, it's unmeasurable, actually. You know, that I think should be more credited.
He
I
had
think
a lot of
when the entire change of the markets happened, you know, when rock and roll became new pop
right.
at that time, after jazz kind of started, you know, fading from that mainstream spot, you know. So when he was, I watched a documentary about him, and you can see that he was unhappy about all of these young rock bands kind of all of a sudden making all that money and selling the venues, and he's playing clubs again, and so he wanted to make a change. And then around that time he met Betty Davis, and then she was much younger than him, and she influenced his you know, even his style of dressing up, you know.
He wanted to look like Sly Stone and Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, and she introduced him to Jimi Hendrix and everybody, and so it really they even actually recently I listened to this Betty Davis album of unreleased stuff that was produced by Miles. I mean, he was in a studio and you can hear him, you know, on some of the tracks kind of making comments. But he's credited as producer, so it was really it was very short but very eventful relationship between them. And if you haven't, you must check out Betty Davis. Betty Davis, who was Miles Davis's wife for a short period, and then she had a solo career. She had a few albums in the early to mid 70s. And she was a revolutionary in her own way. So check her out, Betty Davis. There's a nice documentary too about her that just came out 2-3 years ago. So
the fact that people helped him and he helped other people was a really good symbiotic relationship. So I think where people broke away from him and found success, I'll do my best to just roll them off. Think about it as guys that took off away from him and did really well. John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley.
So many to mention. I think, and everybody's a giant.
Bill Evans.
Keith Jarrett, and
right.
Herbie Hancock,
and then
Marcus Miller, John Scott.
And even George Benson stopped in for the album Miles in the Sky. Great. Joe Beck was on a Miles Davis thing. But then when you look at Wayne Shorter jumping out of the Miles Davis group with Joe Zawinul from, you know, Europe, and they make Weather Report. So look at when Miles is in his electric creational phase, what really happens? Tony Williams, believe it or not, drummer, and, first guy to kind of leave and say, "Yeah, I'm going to do Lifetime." He does Lifetime with Larry Young, who he had used on Bitches Brew, and John McLaughlin, and to be joined later by Jack Bruce. So you had that was a fusion-esque jazz rock band that excited people, and you know,
and not to forget, actually, I think very, very important is Billy Cobham's Spectrum.
Yeah,
I think there are all of these influences. I mean, came from that Miles period, and that became, I think, at that time it was the best-selling jazz album of the era. You know, Spectrum by Billy Cobham, and that's how I got actually into Miles Davis. I got to it through Deep Purple. Deep Purple, Tommy Bolin, Billy Cobham, and then all of these other guys, Jan Hammer and Lee Sklar were there. So it's such a unique combination. And they're
all different drummers. So like Billy Cobham also plays on the Jack Johnson album, which is almost like semi-rock with John McLaughlin, and so Herbie Hancock as another major breakaway figure away from Miles at some point. I mean, he literally launched his own little electric revolution that went into funk and different areas, but already was tying up for the task by doing a bunch of solo albums on the side, film soundtracks, and by the time he did Headhunters, he was all friggin' 6 cylinders, and he had Bernie Maupin in that band playing bass clarinet, who was on Bitches Brew, right? So Bitches Brew has all the guys on it that would go out into different places. Jack DeJohnette also, but Chick Corea, right, who later would first replace Herbie Hancock on keyboards, was, you know, an amazing player in not just, you know, going into the electric keyboards that Miles asked him to, and when Miles wanted to drive, I guess, Bitches Brew around like a car, if you will, he took that quintet to Europe, which was Wayne Shorter, Dave Holland doing electric bass and acoustic bass, Chick Corea doing Fender Rhodes, keyboards, piano, and then Jack DeJohnette on drums. It was a very exciting quintet. They played the Fillmore, but if you listen to one of these, what they called the bootleg series, even though it wasn't really a bootleg, Live in Europe came out in about 2013 or so, somewhere around that time. Is a 3 CD set, and there are drum solos, bass solo,
and everything is different every night.
Yeah.
Actually, I listened to that.
And so that I was really impressed with, because they kept.
But it really showed what it was about. It's all music, and it happens. It was, they live in a moment, but
it wasn't. But also, it was pulling from the other stuff he was doing. He was pulling from the quintet stuff a little bit, like songs like Directions and Mascalero. He was doing those songs live, Wayne Shorter, compositions, and then pushing it into the Bitches Brew thing. But then realized something about that setup. There were European members that he worked with, and then eventually there weren't a lot of European members. There were a lot more American guys popping into the band, right? So, after you got from after you got out of Jack Johnson and you got into the
and then you had Ayrton, so it's you get people from all around
on the corner. You had funky Michael Henderson.
Yeah, on the corner.
Michael Henderson from Stevie Wonder. He recruited him because he goes, I don't know anything about jazz. I don't need you to know anything about jazz. Just play what you're playing. And McLaughlin actually plays really well. But then guys like Dave Liebman into the get that Steve Grossman.
Yeah, and he was part of that Isle of Wight documentary, so he was he gave some good interviews there.
And then you get these guitar players like Pete Cozy to get into the band that did the backup on Electric Mud from Muddy Waters, right? Who's the other guy? You had Pete Cozy and it'll come to me. Reggie Lucas, I think, was the other guitar player. And you had, like I said, Michael Henderson, and then you had Al Foster on drums, and you had Bedell Roy, and all this percussion happening. And what was dropping out was more the main keyboard function was dropping away. And then by the time you got to those last key live albums recorded in Japan that are pretty amazing, Agharta and Pangea, Miles himself is playing the organ when he's not playing the trumpet. And they're just going for that. They're a very straight funk beat, but they take it into places that's not straight funk. It's not jazz. There's improvisation. I think guys like, again, Dave Liebman, Steve Grossman, they get their rocks off just going crazy on that. So a lot of players, careers, and I didn't even name all of them. I'm just touching on them. But in the 80s, all those guys went out and did careers that played with them. Like we already said, Marcus Miller and Schofield, Mike Stern, right? All these, so there's a lot of love for this guy Miles Davis from different generations. When he was at the end of his career, he willingly / surprisingly did that retrospective concert with Quincy Jones, where they invited all the
so
everybody
in documentary,
right.
It's like sadly, he actually performed in Belgrade just before he passed away, like maybe in the last year or something like that, and I didn't see it. I was very young, but I mean, I wasn't into it.
I saw him for you.
That was the same year, yeah.
I was happy to see him. I'm not gonna lie and say he was perfect that night because everybody had the same conclusion. But I was glad
he was there. As we talked about just before, you see some of your idols, and even if they're not on best night, but you see them, man.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. I would never judge them that way, especially when I was a kid, at that time, and back then when I was growing up, not many bands would come. So you really cherish every moment. We had within a few years we had B.B. King, and then we had Mick Taylor came with Snowy White, and then who else? James Brown came. So very, very kind of mixed lineups. of bands and artists. So every single show you see, you really cherish and you're thankful for it. So,
I think so.
okay.
Out of all his albums, even though it's easy to say, oh, I like Bitches Brew, but I do like Bitches Brew a lot. I always go back to it. I'm always listening to it. I never stop.
It's great, but it's like it's rock and roll. It's heavy. It's heavy experimental.
It very much
stuff.
is.
But I'm thinking, if I would choose album to recommend to somebody who's never listened to Miles Davis, maybe it would be A Kind of Blue, because everything is so
easy for
in
people.
your face and so kind of
Yeah.
you can digest it and you can really enjoy the beauty of it.
It gets to be one of the most recommended jazz albums of all time, so it's like an easy go-to. And I knew one friend of mine who said, "Ooh, I didn't know if I could get into that." I go, "Good. Well, we can't talk about jazz then. You're done. I won't waste time with you." But if I had to go beyond that for people, I mean, sure, Sketches of Spain, if just to go a different route. Milestones was also pretty straight ahead. Still staying more bop right before Kind of Blue. I'd recommend that. On the side of the quintet in the 60s, I would say Miles Smiles, and if they can handle the Nefertiti aggression, he amps it up a little bit with that acoustic quintet. That's just great to listen to because you can just hear it going a certain way before he starts breaking it into electric keyboards break in when he gets to the other albums that will come in.
I think what makes Miles Davis great, that if you really get into Miles Davis, you can start collecting and listening to all of these albums, and you can spend your entire life just dedicating time to listening to Miles Davis, and you always have something fresh to revisit because you get tired of electric period, you go to like 50s, and then you go to 60s, and then if you want to listen to some like funkier stuff, or like whatever the 80s were, so you will discover very different eras and very different bands, but he was the one who connected all of this.
All of it. And you can't get tired of it. You're right. I do that. I just flip back and forth. And I'd recommend people go listen to Miles Davis, discover, make your own conclusions, and you make your own podcast on it for a week. Yeah, we'd be good with that.
Yeah, and actually turn this podcast off right now. Go and listen and enjoy. There's so much great music that you can discover.
Because you know why? Because we have to go catch the roundabout.